They thought the crown would break her. They thought a scholar's daughter, soft from years among dusty books and whispered prayers, would shatter under the weight of destiny, that she would beg, that she would weep, that she would prove once and for all that mortals were meant to kneel before the immortal. They were wrong. Isolde Ravenmere stood before the Grand Council in her 53rd year storm, threading through hair that had once been raven black, and the weight of the crown upon her brow felt lighter than the pages of the ancient text she had carried in her youth. Around her, representatives from 7 species waited in silence. Vampires with their eternal stillness, humans with their fragile hope, and others creatures that had emerged from shadow only because one young woman had dared to believe the world could change. "Your Majesty," the speaker began, but Isolde raised one hand. "No speeches today." Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had earned every inch of her power. "Today we remember how it began." She turned toward the great window where moonlight painted the assembled crowd in shades of silver and gold. Somewhere in that crowd stood her daughter. And somewhere, watching from the shadows as he always did, stood the king who had claimed her 3 decades ago. "It began," Isolde said softly, "with a sacrifice no one wanted me to make." The chamber held its breath. It began with faith when everyone else saw only monsters. And as the candles flickered and the moon climbed higher, Isolde Ravenmere closed her eyes and remembered the girl she had been. The terrified 23-year-old virgin who had walked into a cathedral full of vampires and changed the world. 30 years earlier, the letter arrived on a Tuesday. Isolde would remember that detail forever, the way one remembers the exact moment before everything familiar crumbles into dust. Tuesday, the day her father always prepared his sermon for the coming Sunday. The day she always cataloged new acquisitions in the church library, her fingers tracing spines of books older than any living parishioner. She had been translating a 14th century manuscript when Reverend Matthias Ravenmere appeared in the doorway of her study, his face the color of old parchment. "Father," Isolde set down her pen, concern blooming in her chest. At 55, Matthias was strong as an oak, steady as the stone foundations of their church. She had never seen him look so fragile. He held a letter, black wax seal, the kind of official correspondence that came from the other world, the one that existed parallel to theirs, the one most humans pretended wasn't real. "They know," he whispered. 2 words. They contained everything. Isolde's hands stilled on the manuscript. Ancient Aramaic swam before her eyes, words about covenants and blood sacrifices and the price of peace between warring peoples. How fitting, she thought distantly, that she had been translating this particular text. How? Her voice remained steady. 23 years of training and self-control of learning that a minister's daughter must never show fear, never display doubt. Useful skills, as it turned out, for facing the unthinkable. "I don't know." Matthias sank into the chair across from her, suddenly looking every one of his years. "I hid it so carefully. Your mother's bloodline, the connection to the Ravenmere house. I thought I had buried it deep enough that no one would ever tell me what they want." Her father's hands trembled as he broke the seal. The letter unfurled like a snake. Isolde watched the words take shape, each sentence a nail in the coffin of her ordinary life. "By order of the Grand Council of the Nightborn Territories, all living descendants of the 7 sacred bloodlines are hereby summoned to present themselves at the Cathedral of Eternal Night for the choosing ceremony." The choosing. Isolde spoke the words carefully, as if they might shatter if handled roughly. "That's what they're calling it." Matthias looked up at her, and she saw tears in his eyes. Her father, who had stood firm through the deaths of half his congregation to plague, who had buried her mother without shedding a single tear in public, was weeping. "The breeding covenant," he said hoarsely. "That's what it really is. They want, they need." He couldn't finish. Isolde didn't need him to. She had read extensively about vampire culture, despite her father's protest that such knowledge was dangerous for a young woman. She knew that vampire reproduction was rare, difficult, often unsuccessful. She knew that human bloodlines with certain genetic markers could increase the odds of conception, of carrying a pregnancy to term, of producing offspring with desirable traits. She knew, in short, that she was being summoned as breeding stock. "How many?" she asked quietly. "What? How many daughters from the 7 bloodlines are being called?" Matthias consulted the letter. 7, 1 from each house. 7 girls. 7 families who had hidden their dangerous lineages for generations, trying to protect their children from becoming pawns in immortal politics. All that careful secrecy undone in a single summons. Isolde stood and walked to the window. Outside, the spring afternoon painted the world in gentle colors. Children played in the church courtyard. Mrs. Henderson hung laundry in her garden. The baker's son courted the blacksmith's daughter by the old oak tree. Normal, human, safe. Everything she was about to lose. We could run, Matthias said desperately. We could leave the country, change our names, disappear. They would find us. Isolde kept her gaze on the world outside. And when they did, the punishment would fall on the entire congregation. You know that, Father? Then I'll go. I'll offer myself in your place. I'm of the bloodline too, even if I'm male, even if I'm... You're not what they want. She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him fall silent. This isn't a negotiation, Father. They're not asking. They're taking. Isolde, when is the ceremony? 3 days. His voice broke. 3 days to say goodbye to everything you know. 3 days. Isolde had always believed she would have more time. Time to finish her translations. Time to catalog the library properly. Time to find whatever it was she had always sensed was missing from her quiet scholarly life. Time to at least be kissed. She pushed that thought away viciously. Vanity had no place in this moment. Then we have 3 days to prepare, she said firmly. I'll need to finish the Aramaic manuscript. Someone should complete that work, and I want to visit Mother's grave. And there are several books I've been meaning to read. How can you be so calm? Matthias surged to his feet. They're going to take you from me. My only child, my precious girl. They're going to give you to some monster who will... Father. Isolde crossed to him and took his hands. They were cold, trembling. She squeezed them tightly. Listen to me. I am terrified. I'm so frightened I can barely breathe. But fear won't change what's coming. So I choose to spend our last 3 days together doing the things we love. Can you do that with me? He pulled her into his arms and held her the way he had when she was small, when the world's sorrows could be soothed by a father's embrace. But Isolde wasn't small anymore, and some sorrows were too vast for comfort. I'm so sorry, Matthias whispered into her hair. I should have protected you better. You gave me 23 good years, Isolde replied. That's more than most people get. She didn't cry. Not then. Not over the next 3 days as she prepared for a future she couldn't imagine. Not when the other 6 families arrived at the church bringing their terrified daughters to gather before the journey. But on the 3rd night alone in her room, surrounded by the books that had been her companions and the research that had been her purpose, Isolde Ravenmere allowed herself one moment of grief for the life she would never live. Then she dried her eyes, straightened her spine, and prepared to meet her fate. The Cathedral of Eternal Night stood at the border between worlds. Isolde had read about it in her studies, seen sketches in ancient texts, but nothing had prepared her for the reality. The structure rose from the earth like a prayer carved in stone, and shadow its spires reaching toward a sky that seemed darker here, as if the laws of nature bent differently in this place. 7 carriages stopped at the massive entrance. 7 daughters emerged, each accompanied by a parent who looked as though they were escorting a child to execution. Perhaps they were. Isolde stepped down from her carriage and looked up at the cathedral doors, 20 feet tall, made of wood so old it had turned black with age, carved with symbols that made her scholar's mind ache with the desire to translate them even now. Stay together, Matthias urged the group. The other 6 girls clustered close, drawing strength from proximity. They were all young, all virgin, all from bloodlines that traced back to some dimly remembered connection to vampire nobility. Clara Whitmore, barely 18, clung to her mother's hand. The twins Beatrice and Bridget Ashford held each other and whispered prayers. Margaret Thornhill stood stiff as a statue, her jaw set in defiance. The Blackwood girl Rosalind looked like she might faint, and Evangeline Cross wept silently, tears streaming down porcelain cheeks. 7 sacrificial lambs dressed in white ceremonial gowns that had been provided by the council. White for purity, white for virginity, white for surrender. Isolde smoothed her hands down the fabric of her gown and felt a small weight hidden beneath the bodice. She had secreted a few pages from her Aramaic manuscript there, folded small and tucked against her heart. A talisman. A reminder that she had a mind, not just a body. The cathedral doors opened without anyone touching them. Silence fell. From the darkness within, a figure emerged, male, vampire, ancient. His face bore the marks of centuries, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The 7 are summoned, he intoned. Enter and present yourselves before the Grand Council. The parents moved to follow, but the vampire raised one hand. Only the chosen may enter. No, Matthias stepped forward. I won't let my daughter go in there alone. The covenant is clear, Reverend Ravenmere. The vampire's eyes, red as blood rubies, fixed on Matthias. You may wait here. Your daughter will be returned to you. Or she will not. Clara Whitmore's mother began to sob. The sound echoed off the cathedral, stones raw and terrible. Isolde made a decision. She stepped forward away from the clustered group and looked back at her father. "I'll go first," she said quietly. "Isolde, no, someone has to." She managed a smile, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Might as well be the daughter who's been studying vampire customs for 5 years. It was meant to be a joke, but no one laughed. Isolde turned to the other girls. They stared at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Stay together," she told them. "Remember your worth. Remember that you are not just bodies, you are minds, souls, daughters of proud houses." She swallowed hard. "And remember that sometimes courage is simply refusing to give fear a voice." Then, before her own fear could overwhelm her, Isolde Ravenmere walked through the cathedral doors and into the world of the immortal. 200 vampires filled the cathedral. Isolde stopped 3 steps inside her breath, catching at the sheer impossibility of it. She had known intellectually that vampires existed in large numbers, but knowing and seeing were different things. They lined the pews like sculptures carved from marble and shadow. Some appeared young, frozen in their 20s or 30s. Others bore the weight of centuries in their eyes, even if their faces remained unlined. All of them turned to watch her enter. All of them were perfectly, inhumanly still. No breathing, no fidgeting, just presence. The ancient vampire who had met them outside gestured for Isolde to approach the altar. She walked down the center aisle, her white gown whispering against stone floors that had been worn smooth by countless feet over countless years. At the front of the cathedral, 7 thrones had been arranged in a semicircle. 6 were occupied by vampires whose power pressed against Isolde's senses like atmospheric pressure before a storm. The 7th throne sat empty. Isolde Ravenmere, the vampire who spoke, sat at the center position. Female. Beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. Daughter of Matthias Ravenmere, descended from the house of Ravenmere through your maternal bloodline. 23 years old. Virgin. Scholar. It wasn't a question, but Isolde nodded anyway. "You understand why you have been summoned." "I understand that the breeding covenant requires representatives from the 7 sacred bloodlines," Isolde replied, keeping her voice steady. "I understand that vampire reproduction is difficult, and that certain human bloodlines increase the odds of successful conception. I understand that I have been chosen as a potential candidate." She couldn't quite bring herself to say the word mate. It felt too intimate, too final. The female counselor's lips curved slightly. "You have been studying us." "I've been studying everything," Isolde said. "Ancient languages, religious texts, cultural anthropology. Vampire customs were simply one topic among many." "Nerves make her talkative," one of the other counselors observed. "How charming." Isolde felt her cheeks flush. She had always talked too much when frightened, a nervous habit her father had tried to train out of her. "Bring in the others," the lead counselor commanded. The remaining 6 girls were escorted into the cathedral. They clustered together near the back, none of them willing to approach the thrones the way Isolde had. "Show them courage," her father had always said, "even when you feel none." Isolde stood alone at the front and waited. "The breeding covenant is ancient," the lead counselor began, her voice carrying through the vast space. "Established in the first age when our kind and yours first learned to coexist. The 7 sacred bloodlines agreed to provide candidates when called upon. In exchange, those bloodlines received protection wealth and the assurance that their descendants would never be harmed by vampire kind. A contract signed by our ancestors," Isolde said quietly, "that we are now bound to honor." "Precisely." The counselor gestured to the empty throne. "Our king requires a mate. One of you will be chosen. The others will return to their families, their obligation fulfilled, their bloodlines released from the covenant for another generation." Only one. Relief and dread warred in Isolde's chest. 6 would go home. 6 would return to their normal lives. One would not. "The king will arrive shortly," the counselor continued. "He will make his choice. There will be no negotiation, no appeals. His decision is final." The massive doors at the opposite end of the cathedral began to open. Every vampire in the chamber rose to their feet in perfect unison. The sound of 200 beings moving as one sent chills down Isolde's spine. He entered alone. Theron Nightshade was enormous. Not just tall, though he stood at least 7 feet, but present in a way that seemed to fill the entire cathedral. His hair fell past his shoulders in waves the color of fresh snow, stark against the black formal attire that all hugged a frame of pure lethal power. But it was his eyes that made Isolde forget how to breathe. Ice blue, cold as winter, old as the foundations of the world. and fixed directly on her. Theron walked down the center aisle with the grace of a predator. Not the stalking crouch of a hunting cat, but the absolute confidence of something that had never known fear, never known defeat, never known anything but total dominion. He passed Isolde without a glance, ascending to the empty throne. When he sat, the 6 counselors bowed deeply. "My king," the lead counselor said. "The 7 are assembled." Theron's gaze swept over the candidates. Isolde watched his eyes dismiss Clara Whitmore with barely a pause. The twins he studied for a moment longer before moving on. Margaret Thornhill straightened under his attention, trying to appear strong, but Isolde saw the terror in her eyes. Then Theron's gaze returned to Isolde. She didn't look away. Couldn't look away. His eyes held her pinned like a butterfly to a board, every instinct screaming at her to lower her gaze, to show submission, to behave like prey. But Isolde Ravenmere had never been good at following instinct. "You," Theron said. His voice was deep, resonant, cold as the space between stars. "Approach." Isolde's feet carried her forward before her mind fully processed the command. She stopped 3 feet from his throne, close enough to see that his stillness wasn't quite perfect. There was something in his eyes, some flicker of, "What interest surprise your name?" "Isolde Ravenmere, your majesty." "Isolde." He repeated her name as if testing the shape of it. "Do you know why you have been summoned?" "To potentially serve as your mate, your majesty. To fulfill the obligations of the breeding covenant. To provide heirs for the vampire crown." Recited like a lesson learned by rote. A hint of amusement colored his tone. "Tell me what you think of this arrangement." The question caught her off guard. Isolde hesitated, aware of 200 vampires watching, waiting. "I think," she began carefully, "that I have very little power in this situation. I think that my preferences are irrelevant. I think that whether I approve or disapprove changes nothing." "Honest, good." Theron leaned forward slightly. "But you didn't answer the question. What do you think of being offered to me like a sacrifice on an altar?" Something in Isolde snapped. Perhaps it was the stress of the last 3 days. Perhaps it was the knowledge that 6 other girls were listening, waiting to see if courage was possible. Perhaps it was simply that she had spent 23 years being told to be quiet, be small, be acceptable. "I think it's barbaric," she said clearly. "I think taking women from their families, judging them like livestock, choosing one to bind to your bed and your throne without any consideration for their desires or dreams is a practice that belongs in history books, not in the modern age." The cathedral went absolutely silent. Isolde's heart hammered. She had just insulted the vampire king in front of his entire court. She would likely die for that, but at least she would die with her integrity intact. Theron Nightshade studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "I choose her," he announced. The words echoed off the cathedral stones. Final, irrevocable, binding. Isolde felt the world tilt sideways. "Your Majesty," the lead counselor began, "perhaps you would like to consider—" "I have considered." Theron rose from his throne, descending the steps toward Isolde. "I have waited 500 years for the right mate. I will not waste time deliberating when I have found her." He stopped directly in front of Isolde, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You will come with me now," he said. "Not a question, a statement of fact. The other girls will return to their families. The covenant is fulfilled." His hand extended toward her, palm up. An invitation, a command. "Unless you intend to argue further about barbaric practices." Isolde looked at his hand, long fingers, pale as moonlight, not quite human in their perfection. She thought of her father waiting outside, of the library she would never finish cataloging, of the life she would never live. Then she thought of the 6 other girls behind her who would go home because she had been chosen instead. Sometimes sacrifice was the only act of power available. Isolde placed her hand in Theron's. His fingers closed around hers, and the world exploded into light. The sensation lasted only a second, but in that second, Isolde saw everything. She saw herself standing in this same cathedral but wearing a crown. Saw herself older silver threading through her hair, surrounded by creatures that shouldn't exist. Saw a child with white hair and eyes that shifted between blue and brown. Saw centuries stretching ahead like an endless road. Saw Theron looking at her with something that might have been love. Then the vision vanished, and she was standing in the cathedral again, her hand still clasped in his. But something had changed. She could feel it in the air, in the sudden tension that rippled through the assembled vampires. "Impossible," someone whispered. Theron's eyes had widened fractionally. His grip on her hand tightened. "What was that?" Isolde asked. "The recognition." His voice was barely audible. "It only happens when—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider. We need to leave now. He pulled her toward a side door, moving so quickly Isolde nearly stumbled. Behind them, the cathedral erupted into chaos. Voices raised in shock and disbelief in what might have been fear. Isolde caught fragments as Theron dragged her through a corridor carved from living stone, the prophecy, 7 sacred bloodlines, reincarnation, the lost queen. But then they were through another door, and the voices faded into silence. Isolde found herself in a chamber that could only be Theron's private quarters. Vast, elegant, furnished with pieces that looked like they belonged in museums. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a landscape that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight. Theron released her hand and moved to the window, his back to her. You felt it, he said. Not a question. The light, the vision, yes. Do you know what it means? Isolde's scholarly mind raced through every text she had ever read about vampire customs. The recognition. It's mentioned in the old stories. When a vampire finds their true mate, there's a moment of, she struggled for the words, connection, seeing, knowing. It's more than that. Theron turned to face her, and the expression on his face was something Isolde couldn't read. Wonder, fear. The recognition only occurs when a vampire finds the reincarnation of their bonded mate from a previous life. The words hung in the air like a blade about to fall. That's impossible, Isolde said slowly. I'm human. I've only lived 23 years. I can't be. You are. Theron crossed the space between them in 2 strides. I have waited 500 years for you to return. 500 years searching every generation of the sacred bloodlines. And now you stand before me wearing a new face, speaking with a new voice, but carrying the same soul. You're saying I lived before, as a vampire, as your... Isolde couldn't finish the sentence. As my queen. Theron's hand rose trembling slightly and traced the air beside her face without quite touching. You died saving me. Assassins attacked and you threw yourself in their path. You died in my arms, and I swore I would find you again no matter how many lifetimes it took. This was madness. Impossible. But Isolde's scholarly mind insisted on examining the evidence, the vision she had seen, the feeling of recognition that had flooded through her the moment their hands touched. The strange sense all her life that something was missing. I don't remember, she whispered. You will. Theron's fingers finally made contact, brushing her cheek with gentleness that seemed impossible from something so powerful. The transformation will unlock what has been dormant. When you become vampire, you will remember everything. Our life together, the love we shared, the promises we made. The transformation. Isolde stepped back, reality crashing over her. You're going to turn me tonight. Not tonight, Theron's hand dropped. The transformation requires 3 days. 3 days of pain as your human body dies and reforms into something eternal. I will stay with you through every moment. You're asking me to The words came out flat. To give up my humanity, my mortality, everything I am based on a legend and a moment of light. I'm asking you to come home. Theron's eyes blazed with intensity. I'm asking you to remember who you truly are. Isolde's mind spun. This was too much, too fast. She had come here prepared to be a broodmare for some cruel immortal. She had not come prepared to be told she was the reincarnation of a lost vampire queen. I need time, she said. I need to think. There is no time. Theron's voice gentled. The council saw the recognition. They know what you are, and not all of them will be pleased to have the queen return. Why not? Because you changed things. In your previous life, you advocated for reform, for gentleness, for connection with the human world. His smile was bitter. You made many enemies among those who preferred the old ways. Enemies who would be very happy to ensure you never regain your memories. So the danger wasn't theoretical. It was immediate and lethal. Isolde thought of her father waiting outside the cathedral. She thought of the life she had known, simple and safe and utterly ordinary. Then she thought of the vision, the crown, the child, the possibility of becoming something more than a minister's daughter who spent her days translating dead languages. If I refuse, she asked, then I will return you to your father and the covenant will be fulfilled with one of the other candidates. Theron's voice was steady, but Isolde saw something flicker in his eyes. Pain. I will not force this upon you, Isolde, even if it means losing you again. The choice was hers. A real choice which was more than she had expected to have. Isolde Revenmere had spent 23 years preparing for a life of quiet service, translating texts, caring for her father. Perhaps eventually marrying some nice young man from the congregation and raising children who would never know adventure, never know magic, never know the weight of destiny on their shoulders. A good life, a safe life, a small life. She had always known there was something more waiting for her, some purpose larger than the boundaries of her father's church. Perhaps this was it. I'll do it, Isolde said quietly. I'll undergo the transformation. I'll become your queen. But even as the words left her mouth, even as Theron's face blazed with fierce joy, Isolde felt a tremor of doubt. Was she making this choice freely, or was she already being influenced by the memories of a life she couldn't consciously recall? There was no way to know, and no time to find out. The transformation began within the hour. The transformation felt like dying, because it was. Isolde's human body fought against the change with every cell, every breath, every heartbeat that grew slower and slower until it finally stopped altogether. The pain was beyond description, beyond endurance. A fire that consumed from within, burning away everything mortal and rebuilding it into something eternal. 3 days, Theron had said, 3 days of agony. He stayed beside her bed through every moment. When Isolde screamed, her voice raw from hours of torment, Theron held her hand and whispered words in a language she didn't know. When the fever spiked so high that her skin felt like it might combust, he pressed cool cloths to her forehead and murmured promises that this would end, that she would survive, that he would not lose her again. And late in the third night, when the pain finally crested and began to recede like a terrible tide, Theron leaned close and spoke directly into her ear. Remember, he said, remember who you were. But when Isolde opened her eyes, new eyes, vampire eyes that could see in the darkness with perfect clarity, the memories that flooded back were not of a previous life. They were of this one, her father's face when he learned she had been chosen. The weight of her mother's Bible pressed into her hands before she entered the cathedral. The smell of old books in the church library. 23 years of small, human moments that suddenly seemed precious beyond measure now that she had left humanity behind. I don't remember, she whispered, her voice different now, clearer, carrying a resonance that hadn't been there before. I don't remember being your queen. Theron's face, so full of hope, shuddered closed. It will come, he said, but Isolde heard the doubt beneath his certainty. Sometimes the memories take time to surface. Or sometimes, Isolde thought, but didn't say, the recognition had been wrong. Sometimes a moment of light was just a moment, and she was simply a minister's daughter who had been transformed into something she didn't understand. She sat up slowly, testing her new body. Everything felt different, sharper, stronger. Her senses overwhelmed her with input. She could hear heartbeats from servants 5 floors below, could smell the particular blend of herbs in the candles across the room, could see individual dust motes floating in the pre-dawn darkness. How do you feel? Theron asked. Like I died and came back wrong. Not wrong. His hand found hers. Changed. There's a difference. Isolde looked down at their joined hands. She could feel something now, a connection that hummed beneath her skin like a low frequency only she could hear. The bond, the thing that linked vampire mates together, allowing them to sense each other's emotions, each other's presence. Through that bond, she felt Theron's hope, his fear, his desperate love for someone she couldn't remember being. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I know you wanted. Don't apologize for being who you are. Theron squeezed her hand gently. I fell in love with the soul, Isolde. Whether you remember our past or not, that soul is still yours, still hers, still the one I have been searching for. It should have been romantic. It probably was romantic, but Isolde felt only a deep well of uncertainty. She had agreed to this transformation, yes, but she had agreed based on a vision, a moment of light, a promise of memories that had not materialized. Now she was vampire, immortal, bound to a king she barely knew, and she had no idea who she was supposed to be. The next 6 months passed in a blur of learning. Theron proved to be a patient teacher, showing Isolde how to control her new strength, how to move with vampire grace, how to feed without killing. That last lesson had been the hardest. Standing in the castle's donor rooms while willing humans offered their throats, learning to take just enough blood to satisfy the hunger without draining them completely. It's a dance, Theron explained, his hand steady on her shoulder as she fed for the first time. You take what you need, they give willingly, and you stop before the need becomes desire, before the hunger becomes greed. Isolde had managed it barely. The taste of human blood was nothing like she had expected. Not disgusting, not even particularly pleasant. Simply necessary, like breathing, like the beat of a heart she no longer possessed. But harder than learning to feed was learning to navigate the vampire court. The council that had witnessed her recognition treated her with wary respect. Some bowed deeply when she passed. Others watched her with eyes that calculated and measured. And one in particular, a female vampire named Seraphine Blackthorn, made no secret of her displeasure. A human playing at being queen, Seraphine said loudly one evening during a court session, her voice carrying through the throne room. How quaint, how utterly absurd. Isolde had learned enough by then to recognize a challenge when she heard one. Better a human who became vampire by choice than a vampire who never had the courage to be anything else. Isolde replied calmly, meeting Seraphine's ruby gaze without flinching. The throne room went silent. Then Theron, seated beside her on his throne, laughed. The sound was rare enough that every vampire in the chamber turned to stare. She has you there, Seraphine, he said, and the warmth in his voice made something in Isolde's chest tighten. Seraphine's face had flushed with anger, but she had bowed stiffly and retreated. Isolde had felt a small surge of victory, until later when Theron explained that she had just made an enemy of one of the most powerful political figures in the vampire world. Seraphine was a candidate for queen, he said as they walked through the castle gardens that night. 50 years ago when I first began searching for you in earnest, she believed she would be chosen. But you rejected her. I rejected everyone who wasn't you. Theron stopped beneath an ancient oak, its branches spreading wide against the star-filled sky. 500 years of searching, Isolde. 50 years of interviewing candidates. And none of them were right. None of them were her. I'm not her either, Isolde said softly. I'm just me. Isolde Ravenmere, minister's daughter, scholar, someone who happened to look right in a moment of desperation. You're wrong. Theron turned to face her fully, his ice-blue eyes intense in the moonlight. And you are exactly who you've always been. The soul doesn't lie. The recognition doesn't fail. Whether you remember or not, you are my queen. He kissed her then for the first time since her transformation, gentle, reverent, tasting of moonlight and centuries of longing, and Isolde, despite her doubts, kissed him back. The discovery came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Isolde had been in the castle library, a space that rivaled anything she had known in her human life, researching vampire law for an upcoming council session. She had always found comfort in books, in the solid weight of knowledge gathered and preserved. Even immortality couldn't change that. She had been reaching for a volume on the upper shelf when the wave of dizziness hit. Vampires didn't get dizzy. Isolde caught herself on the ladder, breathing carefully through the strange sensation. Not quite nausea, not quite vertigo. Something else. Something that made her newly sensitive body feel foreign and wrong. Your Majesty, the librarian, an ancient vampire named Cornelius, appeared at her elbow. Are you unwell? I'm fine. Isolde began, then stopped, because she could hear it. A second heartbeat. Faint, rapid, impossible, coming from inside her own body. Get Theron, Isolde whispered. Get him now. The next hour was chaos. Physicians summoned, examinations performed, ancient texts consulted. And through it all, that tiny impossible heartbeat continued its steady rhythm. Isolde was pregnant, 6 months after her transformation, carrying a child that should not exist. Vampire pregnancies are rare, the head physician explained, his voice carefully neutral. Extremely rare. Most transformed vampires lose the ability to conceive entirely. For it to happen so quickly after transformation and with such obvious vitality. He gestured helplessly at the diagnostic instruments that showed not just a heartbeat, but a fully formed fetus developing at an accelerated rate. How is this possible? Theron's hand gripped Isolde's tightly enough to hurt. We don't know, Your Majesty. The physician bowed. This pregnancy is unprecedented. The child appears to be developing traits of both human and vampire. A true hybrid. Hybrid. The word hung in the air like prophecy. Isolde pressed her free hand to her abdomen, feeling nothing yet but knowing with absolute certainty that everything had changed. Again. I need to see my father, she said. Reverend Matthias Ravenmere had aged in the 6 months since Isolde's transformation. His hair had gone completely gray. New lines etched his face. But when he saw his daughter approaching the church, escorted by a dozen vampire guards, he ran to her like a man half his age. Isolde. He caught her in an embrace that smelled of old books and communion wine and home. Oh, my girl, my precious girl. Isolde held him tightly, this man who had raised her, who had tried to protect her, who had let her go when the choice was made. Through the bond, she felt Theron's gentle withdrawal, giving them privacy, even though he remained close enough to protect. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner, Isolde said into her father's shoulder. I wanted to wait until I was settled. Settled? Matthias pulled back to look at her. Is that what you are now? I don't know what I am. Isolde touched her stomach unconsciously. Father, I need to tell you something. I need... She took a breath she didn't require. I'm pregnant. The words fell between them like stones into still water. Matthias stared at her. That's, that's impossible. You're a vampire, you can't. I am. The physicians confirmed it. A hybrid child. Half vampire, half. Isolde's voice broke. Half human. My human half. The part of me that's still your daughter. She had expected shock, horror, perhaps even rejection. Instead, Matthias Ravenmere began to weep. A grandchild, he whispered. God in heaven, a grandchild. They moved inside the church into the familiar quiet of the sanctuary. Matthias lit candles out of habit, and Isolde found herself kneeling at the altar rail where she had knelt countless times as a child. I don't know if I'm allowed to pray anymore, she said quietly. I don't know if God hears the prayers of the undead. God hears all prayers, Matthias replied, kneeling beside her, or he hears none. Either way, speaking them can't hurt. So Isolde prayed, not for forgiveness, not for guidance, simply for the strength to face whatever came next. And when she opened her eyes, her father was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. I need to show you something, he said. He led her to the church library, to the section where the oldest manuscripts were kept. His hands still steady despite his age pulled out a leather-bound volume that Isolde recognized immediately. Her mother's journal. I should have given you this years ago, Matthias said, but I was afraid of what it might mean, afraid of the burden it would place on you. He opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon. Your mother had visions. Did you know that? Isolde shook her head, unable to speak. Dreams that came true, warnings about events that hadn't yet happened. The gift ran in her family and the Ravenmere bloodline. Matthias pointed to a passage written in his wife's delicate script. 2 years before you were born, she had a vision. She wrote it down here. Isolde read the words, her new vampire eyes seeing perfectly even in the library's dim light. I saw my daughter standing between two worlds, human and other, mortal and eternal. She wore a crown that blazed with light, and beside her stood a king of shadows. And in her arms she carried a child who would be the first of a new people. A bridge, a beginning. I saw war coming. I saw resistance and fear, and those who would rather destroy than change. But I also saw hope. I saw my daughter choosing love over safety, choosing faith over certainty, choosing to believe that the world could be healed. And I saw her succeed. Isolde's hands trembled as she held the journal. Your mother died bringing you into this world, Matthias said softly. But she died knowing what you would become, knowing the purpose you would serve. He took Isolde's hands in his. I was angry with God for taking her from me, for leaving me to raise you alone. But standing here now, seeing what you've become, understanding what you're meant to do. I think perhaps she knew her sacrifice was necessary. Oh, Father, I bless this union. Matthias interrupted, his voice firm and clear. I bless this child you carry. I bless the work you will do to bring our worlds together. He pulled Isolde into another embrace. God works in mysterious ways, my daughter, even through vampires, even through the impossible. Isolde clung to him and wept, blood tears that stained his shirt, but he didn't pull away. In the doorway, Theron watched in silence, and through the bond, Isolde felt his wonder, his gratitude, his love. The research consumed her. Isolde spent the next 3 months in the castle library poring over every text she could find about vampire-human integration, about ancient prophecies, about the theoretical possibility of uniting two worlds that had existed separately for millennia. And she found it. The convergence. Buried in a manuscript so old the pages crumbled at her touch, written in a dialect of ancient Aramaic that Isolde had spent 5 years learning to read. A ritual, a spell, a prayer, a way to tear down the barriers between the vampire and human realms, to make visible what had been hidden, to create understanding where there had been only fear. It's possible, she told Theron one night, her voice breathless with excitement. Look, the ritual requires representatives from the 7 sacred bloodlines. One must be willing to sacrifice. One must be eternal. And the activation must happen at a moment of absolute faith, when the boundaries between life and death, human and vampire, are thinnest. Theron studied the manuscript carefully. This is legend, Isolde. No one has ever successfully performed the convergence. Because no one has ever had all the necessary components. Isolde placed her hand over her growing belly. Their child had developed rapidly over the past months, visible now even through her clothing. But we do. The 7 bloodlines, a vampire king and a transformed human queen, and a hybrid child who exists as living proof that our kinds can merge. If we attempt this and fail, then we fail. Isolde met his eyes steadily. But if we don't try, if we continue to let our worlds exist in shadow and separation, then what is my transformation for? What is our child's existence for? What is any of this sacrifice and change and impossibility for? Through the bond she felt Theron's resistance, his fear, his desperate desire to keep her safe, to protect her from the dangers that attempting something like this would bring. But she also felt buried deep his hope. You would need support, he said finally. The council would have to approve. Human leaders would have to cooperate. This isn't something we can do alone. Then we build a coalition. Isolde pulled out the pages she had been drafting. I've made lists, vampire houses that might support integration, human religious and political leaders who have shown openness to our kind. We start small, we build trust, and we create a foundation strong enough to support the change we're proposing. It could take years. We're immortal, we have time. Theron looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had been a frightened scholar 6 months ago and was now proposing to fundamentally alter the structure of reality. When did you become so certain? He asked. When I felt our daughter move for the first time, Isolde replied, and I realized I wanted her to grow up in a better world than the one we inherited. So they began. The coalition building was slow, frustrating work. Some vampire houses welcomed the idea of integration. Others rejected it with barely concealed hostility. The human side was even more complicated. Religious leaders who had spent their lives teaching that vampires were demonic faced difficult questions about whether reconciliation was possible. Political leaders worried about power structures, about resources, about the thousand practical complications that arose when trying to merge two fundamentally different societies. But slowly, painfully, a group emerged. 12 vampires willing to support the convergence. 12 humans brave enough to work beside them. And at the center of it all, Isolde Ravenmere, 7 months pregnant and more determined than anyone had ever seen her. You should rest, Theron urged, after a particularly grueling session with human religious leaders. The pregnancy is taking a toll. The pregnancy is giving me purpose, Isolde countered. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the strong kicks of a child who seemed entirely too active for something not yet born. Every day I carry her, I'm more convinced this is right, that she deserves to grow up in a world where she doesn't have to hide half of what she is. It was during one of these coalition meetings that the final piece fell into place. An elderly human scholar, a woman who had devoted her life to studying vampire history, brought a manuscript that made Isolde's breath catch. I found this in a monastery library, the woman explained. It's a companion text to the convergence ritual. It explains what the hybrid child represents. Isolde read the translation with Theron looking over her shoulder. The first. Not merely a child of two worlds, but the blueprint for a new species. When the first is born, the old barriers will weaken. When the first takes breath, the veil will thin. The first is not the end of the prophecy. The first is the beginning of integration itself. Our daughter, Isolde whispered. She's not just a hybrid. She's the key, Theron finished. Her birth will be the catalyst, which meant they needed to time the convergence ritual carefully, very carefully. And it meant that anyone who opposed integration would see Isolde's pregnancy as a threat. The attack came 2 weeks before Isolde's due date. She had been in the castle gardens, walking to ease the constant discomfort of late pregnancy, when the world suddenly tilted. Hands grabbed her. A cloth pressed over her mouth, bitter with some substance that made her vampire strength falter. Isolde fought, but her body was awkward, heavy with child. She managed to cry out once before darkness claimed her. She woke in a stone chamber she didn't recognize. Cold, damp, underground. And standing before her was Seraphine Blackthorn. You're awake. Good. Seraphine's voice was calm, almost pleasant. I was hoping we could talk before the end. Isolde struggled against the chains that bound her to the wall. Silver, the one metal that could harm a vampire, burn them, weaken them. Her wrists were already blistering. The convergence, Seraphine continued, circling Isolde like a predator. Did you really think the old families would allow such a thing? Did you truly believe we would surrender millennia of power, of secrecy, of superiority, just so humans and vampires could hold hands and sing songs together? It's not about holding hands, Isolde managed. It's about survival, about evolution, about creating something better than what we have now. Better for whom? Seraphine stopped directly in front of her. Better for mongrel children like the thing you're carrying. Better for weak humans who can barely manage their own societies, or better for vampires who have existed perfectly well in shadow for thousands of years. Better for everyone who's tired of living in fear. Seraphine laughed. Noble words from someone who's only been vampire for 6 months. You know nothing of our world, little scholar, nothing of what it costs to maintain the balance between our kind and theirs. Then teach me, Isolde said desperately. Explain why integration is wrong. Convince me that hiding in secrets and maintaining walls between people who could help each other is the right path. I don't need to convince you of anything. Seraphine's hand moved to Isolde's swollen belly, pressing just hard enough to be threatening. I just need to ensure that your mongrel child is never born, that the prophecy dies with you, that the old ways continue. Terror flooded through Isolde, not for herself, for the life she carried, for the future that depended on one impossible child. Theron will find me, she said, trying to sound certain. The bond will lead him here. The bond requires time to trace, and these chambers are warded against such magic. Seraphine smiled. By the time he finds you, it will be far too late. Isolde closed her eyes, reaching through the bond as hard as she could, sending not just location but emotion. Fear, love, desperate need, and something else, something that surprised even her. Faith. Faith that Theron would come. Faith that the child would survive. Faith that the convergence was meant to happen, that the prophecy was real, that everything she had sacrificed and changed and become was leading to this moment. Faith like her mother had written about. Faith like her father had taught her. Faith that didn't require certainty, only the courage to believe when all evidence suggested despair. I forgive you, Isolde said quietly. Seraphine's hand stilled. What? I forgive you. Isolde opened her eyes, meeting Seraphine's gaze directly. I forgive you for your fear, for your anger, for believing that the only way to be safe is to make others afraid. You forgive me, Seraphine's voice rose. You forgive me. I'm about to end. You end, your child end, this entire foolish dream of integration in you. I forgive you, Isolde repeated, because I understand. Change is terrifying. Letting go of power is terrifying. Trusting that something new might be better than what we've always known is the hardest thing in the world. She managed a small smile. But I've learned something in the last 6 months. Fear is just another kind of prison, and the only way to be free is to choose love instead. Seraphine stared at her. You're insane. Maybe. Isolde's smile widened. Or maybe I'm just a minister's daughter who still believes in grace. The words had barely left her mouth when light exploded through the chamber. Not torchlight, not sunlight, something else. Something that blazed from Isolde's chest, from the child she carried, from the very core of her being. The convergence. It was happening, not according to plan, not at the ritual site with the coalition gathered and the proper ceremonies performed, but happening anyway, activated by faith so pure and strong that it bypassed all the careful preparations. Isolde felt the barriers between worlds tear like fabric, felt the veil that separated vampire from human, immortal, from mortal shadow, from light shred into pieces, felt for one impossible moment connected to every living thing in both realms. The light grew blinding. Isolde heard Seraphine scream, felt the silver chains fall away, felt strong arms catch her as she collapsed. Theron, he had found her. Of course he had found her. I have you, he breathed against her hair. I have you both. And through the bond, through the light, through the wave of magic that was still rippling outward in expanding circles, Isolde felt something shift. The convergence had worked. Partially. Not fully, not permanently, but enough. Enough to create cracks in the barriers. Enough to make visible what had been hidden. Enough to prove that integration was possible. As consciousness faded, Isolde's last coherent thought was gratitude. Gratitude that she had been brave enough to believe. She woke 3 days later in the castle infirmary. Theron sat beside her bed just as he had during her transformation, his hand holding hers. The baby? Isolde's first words urgent and afraid. Safe. Developing normally. Theron's relief flooded through the bond. The physicians say the convergence actually stabilized the pregnancy. You should deliver within the week. Isolde sagged back against the pillows. Safe. Their daughter was safe. Seraphine, alive, unconscious. When she wakes, she'll stand trial for kidnapping the queen. Theron's voice hardened. I should execute her. Don't. Isolde, don't. She squeezed his hand weakly. She acted out of fear, and in the end her actions triggered the convergence. Without her, we might never have discovered that faith alone could activate the ritual. Through the bond, she felt Theron's resistance, his rage at what had almost been lost, his desperate need to protect, but also slowly his understanding. You're too forgiving, he said. I'm exactly forgiving enough. Isolde managed a smile. Besides, we're going to need people like Seraphine, People who understand the old ways, people who can help bridge the transition. You want to make an ally of someone who tried to kill you. I want to prove that change is possible. Isolde pulled him closer, even for those who resist it most strongly. Over the next week, as Isolde's body prepared for birth, the world outside the castle transformed. The partial convergence had worked exactly as the prophecy predicted. Vampires were suddenly visible to humans who had never been able to perceive them before. Humans could now enter vampire territories that had been hidden for millennia. The veil between worlds hadn't fallen completely, but it had thinned enough that separation was no longer absolute. Panic swept through both populations. Fear, anger, confusion, but also in some quarters, hope. The coalition Isolde had built swung into action, mediating conflicts, explaining the change, working to prevent the violence that threatened to erupt when two worlds collided. And in a surprising turn, Seraphine Blackthorn, having witnessed the power of the convergence firsthand, agreed to use her influence to calm the vampire houses that opposed integration. I was wrong, she told Isolde during a brief visit to the infirmary. Not about everything. Integration will be difficult and dangerous and costly. But I was wrong to believe that preventing it was possible. The prophecy is real. Your daughter is coming. And the only choice now is whether we guide this change or let it destroy us. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was a beginning. Lysandra was born on a Tuesday, just like the day the letter had arrived to change Isolde's life. The labor was long, difficult, dangerous enough that even vampire physicians worried. But when Isolde finally held her daughter, all the pain dissolved into wonder. She was perfect. White hair like her father, eyes that shifted between ice blue and warm brown depending on her mood, tiny fingers that already gripped with surprising strength. A hybrid, the first, the blueprint for a new species, the beginning of everything. Theron stood beside the bed looking down at his daughter with an expression of such fierce love that Isolde felt tears sting her eyes. She's beautiful, he whispered. She's perfect. She's ours. Isolde finished. She's ours. And as the sun rose over a world forever changed as vampire and human alike tried to navigate this new reality, as the prophecy unfolded exactly as it had been written, Isolde Ravenmere held her daughter close and understood finally what she had been meant to become. Not the reincarnation of a lost queen, simply a mother, a bridge, a woman who had faith enough to believe the impossible. And sometimes that was enough to change the world. The first year was chaos. Not the violent chaos of war, though there were skirmishes. Not the destructive chaos of collapse, though systems strained under the weight of change. But the complicated, messy chaos of two worlds learning to coexist when every instinct screamed for separation. Isolde navigated it all with Lysandra strapped to her chest in a carrier that Theron had commissioned from the finest craftsmen in both realms, human and vampire, learning to work together, creating something beautiful from the joining of their skills, like their daughter. Lysandra grew faster than human children, but slower than vampire young. By 6 months, she was walking. By 9 months, speaking in complete sentences. By her first birthday, she could read simple texts in 3 languages and had accidentally set fire to the curtains in the nursery with a power no one had anticipated. Empathic projection, the physicians explained, examining the scorch marks with fascination. She felt your fear when the guards burst in, and her power manifested that emotion as flame. It's unprecedented. Everything about Lysandra was unprecedented. She could walk in sunlight without harm, her hybrid nature protecting her from the weakness that plagued pure vampires. She could charm both humans and vampires with equal ease, her smile transcending the barriers of species. And she possessed an empathic ability so strong that Isolde often had to shield her from the overwhelming emotions of the crowds that gathered whenever the royal family appeared in public. Too many feelings, Lysandra would say, pressing her small hands to her temples. Mama, too many. So Isolde learned to create quiet spaces for her daughter, gardens where only family could enter, libraries where the only sounds were turning pages and whispered conversations, moments of peace in a world that was still learning how to be peaceful. The integration progressed in fits and starts. The Grand Council, now expanded to include 12 humans alongside the 12 vampire representatives, met monthly to address the endless complications of merging two civilizations. Property disputes, legal jurisdictions, the question of whether vampire law or human law took precedence in conflicts. Isolde chaired these sessions with a patience that surprised even her. She, who had once been terrified of speaking before groups, now commanded the attention of the most powerful beings in both realms. The question isn't whose law is superior, she said during one particularly heated debate. The question is what justice looks like when we're all trying to live together. And justice, I've learned, requires listening before judging, understanding before condemning, grace before punishment. Her father's teachings filtered through her mother's visions shaped into policy. It worked, slowly, painfully, but it worked. Matthias Ravenmere visited often in those early years. He would arrive at the castle with his worn Bible and his gentle smile, and Lysandra would run to him with squeals of delight. Grandfather, grandfather. Watching them together, Isolde felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. Her father, who had lost his wife to childbirth and nearly lost his daughter to the vampire world, had been given this gift, a granddaughter who loved him without reservation, a second chance at family. She's growing so fast, Matthias said one evening as they sat in the castle gardens while Lysandra chased fireflies with supernatural speed. Sometimes I look at her and I see your mother, the same fierce joy, the same certainty that the world is good and kind and worthy of love. Even though she's half vampire, Isolde asked quietly, especially because she's half vampire. Matthias turned to his daughter. Don't you see, Isolde? She's proof that God's grace extends further than our understanding. That love can bridge any divide. That new life can emerge from the most unlikely unions. He paused, watching Lysandra catch a firefly gently in her cupped hands, examining it with wonder before releasing it back into the twilight. I was wrong to fear your transformation, Matthias continued. I thought I was losing you, but you've become more yourself than you ever were before. Braver, stronger, more certain of your purpose. He took Isolde's hand. Your mother would be so proud. Isolde leaned her head on her father's shoulder, this man who had raised her alone, who had taught her about faith and grace and the courage to believe in impossible things. Thank you, she whispered, for letting me go, for trusting that I could find my way. You didn't find your way, my dear. Matthias kissed the top of her head. You made a way where none existed. There's a difference. When Lysandra was 8 years old, the vision came. Isolde woke to the sound of her daughter screaming. Not the startled cry of a nightmare, the raw, terrified sound of someone witnessing horrors beyond comprehension. She and Theron reached Lysandra's room within seconds, finding their daughter huddled in the corner, her eyes wide and unfocused, her small body trembling. They're coming, Lysandra gasped. Mama, they're coming, so many of them. Different, strange, scared and angry and confused. Isolde gathered her daughter into her arms. Who's coming, sweetheart? The others. Lysandra's eyes, still glazed with vision, met her mother's. Not just vampires and humans. Werewolves, fae, demons. Things without names. They've been hiding too, waiting, watching. And now the barriers are falling and they're coming through and everyone's so scared. The vision released its hold suddenly. Lysandra slumped against Isolde, exhausted and shaking. Theron and Isolde exchanged glances over their daughter's head. Through the bond, Isolde felt his shock, his fear, his immediate impulse to somehow prevent what Lysandra had seen. But Isolde had learned something in 8 years of navigating integration. You couldn't stop change. You could only prepare for it. How long, she asked Lysandra gently, how long before they come? Years. Lysandra's voice was small, but not many. Maybe when I'm grown, maybe when I'm ready to help them, maybe when the world was ready for the next phase of the convergence. The years that followed were dedicated to preparing for what Lysandra had foreseen. Lysandra proved to be a brilliant student, absorbing knowledge with her mother's scholarly hunger and her father's strategic mind. She studied under the best teachers from both realms, human philosophers and vampire historians, scientists and mystics. Anyone who could help her understand the world, she would one day help reshape. But she also trained in combat with Theron, learning to defend herself and others. Studied diplomacy with the Grand Council, learning to navigate the treacherous waters of multi-species politics, and spent long hours with her grandfather learning about faith and grace and the power of forgiveness. Seraphine Blackthorn became an unexpected mentor. The vampire who had once tried to prevent Lysandra's birth now devoted herself to preparing the girl for leadership. She taught Lysandra the old ways, the vampire traditions that couldn't be lost even as the world changed. She was stern, demanding, and utterly dedicated to ensuring that Lysandra understood both the weight and privilege of her position. Your mother changed the world through faith and love, Seraphine told Lysandra during one particularly grueling lesson in vampire law. Noble, necessary, but not sufficient. You will need to be harder than she is, sharper, willing to make choices that will haunt you. Why, for Lysandra asked. Because when the other species emerge, they will not all come in peace. Some will come in desperation, some in anger, some seeking dominance. Seraphine's gaze was steady. And you will need to protect both your people and theirs, sometimes from each other, sometimes from themselves. It was harsh teaching, but Lysandra absorbed it, balancing Seraphine's pragmatism with her mother's idealism, her father's strength with her grandfather's compassion. She grew into something unprecedented, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, kind and ruthless, gentle and fierce, a bridge between worlds, a leader for an age that hadn't yet begun. Matthias Ravenmere died in his 77th year on a Tuesday morning in late spring. It was year 22 of the new era. Lysandra had just turned 22, appearing as a woman in her mid-20s at the height of her power and grace. Isolde had been expecting it, had watched her father slow down over the past years, his steps growing heavier, his breath coming shorter, had known with the terrible certainty that came with immortality that she would outlive him by centuries. But knowing didn't make it easier. She sat beside his bed in the church rectory holding his hand as the morning light painted the room in shades of gold. Lysandra knelt on his other side, tears streaming down her face. Theron stood in the doorway, giving them privacy but present for support. "I'm not afraid," Matthias whispered, his voice thin but steady. "I've lived a good life, a blessed life. I raised a daughter who changed the world. I knew a granddaughter who will save it." "Don't," Isolde said, her voice breaking. "Don't talk like you're leaving." "But I am, my dear." Matthias squeezed her hand with what little strength remained. "This is the natural way of things. Humans are meant to die. It's what makes our lives precious. Every moment matters because we know there won't be infinite moments." He turned his head slightly to look at Lysandra. "You're going to do great things," he told her. "Greater than your mother. Greater than anyone expects. But remember what I taught you. Power without compassion is tyranny. Strength without mercy is cruelty. And leadership without love is just another form of slavery." "I'll remember, grandfather." Lysandra's voice broke. "I promise." "Good girl," Matthias smiled. Then he looked back at Isolde. "And you, my brilliant, brave, impossible daughter. Stop trying to save everyone. You've done enough. You've built enough. Let others carry the burden for a while." "I don't know how," Isolde admitted. "Learn." His hand in hers was so frail now, bones wrapped in paper-thin skin. "Trust that the world will keep turning even when you're not watching. Trust that Lysandra is ready. Trust that Theron will support her. Trust that the work you've done has created something strong enough to endure." He took one more breath, released it slowly, and was gone. Isolde felt the absence like a physical wound. The man who had raised her, who had taught her everything she knew about love and faith and courage, was simply not there anymore. She wept, blood tears that stained her father's hand where she held it. Wept for the loss, for the unfairness of mortality and immortality existing side by side, for the knowledge that she would carry this grief for centuries while her father had found peace. Lysandra wept too, pressing her face against her grandfather's chest, her empathic abilities making her feel not just her own grief, but everyone's. And Theron, standing in the doorway, wept for the man who had blessed their union, who had shown him that humanity was worth protecting, who had taught him that faith could be as powerful as any magic. They buried Matthias Ravenmere in the church cemetery beside his wife, beneath a stone that read simply, "Beloved Father and Grandfather." He taught us to believe in grace. The grief changed Isolde in ways she hadn't anticipated. For 22 years, she had been constant motion, building coalitions, mediating disputes, creating policies, never stopping, never resting. Always convinced that if she paused even for a moment, everything she had built would crumble. But her father's death forced her to stop, to sit with the pain, to feel the loss, to understand finally that some things couldn't be fixed or managed or negotiated. Some things simply had to be endured. She withdrew from the Grand Council sessions for 6 months, letting Lysandra and Seraphine and the other leaders handle the day-to-day governance. Spent her time in the castle library reading her father's Bible, translating the Aramaic texts that had first sparked her interest in ancient prophecies. And slowly, gradually, she learned what her father had tried to teach her in his final words: to let go, to trust, to believe that the world she had helped create was strong enough to stand without her constant vigilance. When Isolde returned to active leadership at the end of those 6 months, she was different, softer, more willing to delegate, more accepting of imperfection, and more certain than ever that Lysandra was ready to lead. The multi-species emergence happened exactly as Lysandra had foreseen. It began with whispers, rumors, sightings of creatures that couldn't exist, werewolf packs appearing in forests that had seemed empty, Fey courts manifesting in ancient groves, demons emerging from shadows that had grown too deep. The barriers that the partial convergence had weakened were finally breaking completely. Lysandra, now appearing as a woman in her late 20s, though she was 25 in actual years, took charge with a confidence that made Isolde's heart swell with pride. She reached out to the emerging species with the same combination of strength and compassion that had defined the vampire-human integration. Met with werewolf alphas and fey queens and demon lords. Listened to their fears and their anger and their desperate need for a place in a world that had moved on without them. And she built something new, the Unity Council, representatives from every known species, a governing body that acknowledged differences while insisting on common dignity. It was messy, complicated, sometimes violent when old hatreds surfaced. But it worked. Seraphine proved invaluable during this phase, her centuries of experience and her former resistance making her uniquely qualified to understand and address the concerns of those who feared change. She became Lysandra's chief advisor, the pragmatic voice that balanced the young leader's idealism. Isolde watched her daughter navigate these impossible challenges and felt something in her chest finally settle. The work was being passed to capable hands. The future was secure. Her father had been right. It was time to let others lead. By year 30 of the new era, the world had transformed beyond recognition. Cities where all species mingled freely. Schools where human, vampire, werewolf, and fey children learned together. Laws that protected everyone, not just the powerful or the numerous. It wasn't perfect. Violence still erupted. Prejudice still festered. Fear still caused people to make terrible choices. But it was better. Measurably, undeniably, better than the world Isolde had been born into. The monument was Lysandra's idea. "We need to remember," she said during a Unity Council session, "remember those who died in the conflicts. Remember the cost of the integration. Remember that peace is built on the sacrifices of people who believed change was possible." The monument took 3 years to build, a structure designed by architects from every species incorporating styles and symbols from all cultures. It rose in the heart of the integrated capital, a soaring tribute to loss and hope intertwined. And on a Tuesday in late spring, 30 years to the day since the letter had arrived, that changed everything. The monument was dedicated. Thousands gathered, representatives from every species, leaders and common folk, old and young, all come to witness this moment. Lysandra stood at the base of the monument, crowned that morning as first sovereign of the United Realms. The crown she wore combined vampire silver and fey starlight, and werewolf bone and demon fire and human gold, a physical representation of unity. Isolde and Theron stood in the crowd, watching their daughter prepare to address the assembled masses. "My mother taught me about faith." Lysandra's voice carried across the square, amplified by fey magic. "My father taught me about strength. My grandfather taught me about grace. And all of them taught me that sacrifice is only meaningful when it leads to something better." She gestured to the monument behind her where thousands of names were carved in stone, humans and vampires, and all the others who had died in the conflicts that followed the convergence. These people paid the price for the world we now enjoy. They gave their lives, their safety, their comfort so that we could stand here together. Different species, different perspectives, but united in our commitment to make their sacrifice mean something. Isolde felt Theron's hand find hers, his fingers interlacing with hers, the way they had on that first day in the cathedral 30 years ago. Through the bond, she felt his love, his pride, his profound gratitude that she had been brave enough to believe when everyone else saw only impossibility. "May we never forget their sacrifice," Lysandra concluded, "and may we never take for granted the peace they bought with their blood." The crowd was silent for a long moment. Then as one, they began to applaud. Not the polite applause of formal ceremonies, but the genuine, heartfelt appreciation of people who understood the weight of what had been given. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, Isolde and Theron stood together on a balcony overlooking the city. Below them, the integrated capital blazed with lights from all species. Flying ships powered by fey magic. Streets where werewolves walked beside vampires, walked beside humans. Gardens where demon children played with hybrid children, all of them innocent of the hatreds that had once divided their ancestors. "Do you regret it?" Theron asked quietly. "Any of it?" Isolde considered the question seriously. 30 years as vampire. 30 years of challenges and compromises and impossible choices. 30 years of watching her father age and die while she remained frozen at 23. 30 years of responsibility and burden and the weight of leading a revolution. "Never," she said finally. "Not for a single moment. Even though you lost so much, I didn't lose. Isolde turned to face him fully. I changed. There's a difference. I changed from someone who lived in fear into someone who chose love. From someone who hid in libraries into someone who built a new world. From someone who thought she was ordinary into someone who discovered she was extraordinary. She touched his face gently, this man who had claimed her in a moment of desperation and had spent 3 decades proving that the recognition had been real. You gave me everything, she said softly. A daughter, a purpose, a chance to be more than I ever dreamed possible. How could I regret that? Theron pulled her close and they stood together as the night deepened around them. Lysandra is ready, Isolde said after a long silence. The world is ready, and we can finally rest. Rest. Theron's lips curved into a smile. What does that look like for people like us? I don't know. Isolde leaned into his embrace. But I'm looking forward to finding out. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker like stars brought down to earth. Two people who had started as strangers united by prophecy and necessity had grown into something profound. Partners. Equals. Proof that love could bridge any divide. And in that moment, Isolde Ravenmere understood the final truth her journey had taught her. She had not been chosen because she was special. She had become special because she chose to believe. Chose to have faith when everyone else saw only fear. Chose to love when hatred would have been easier. Chose to build bridges when burning them would have been safer. The girl who had entered the Cathedral of Eternal Night 30 years ago had been ordinary in every way that mattered. Frightened, uncertain, powerless. But she had possessed one extraordinary gift, the courage to take the first step into the unknown. And that single step had led to a journey that transformed not just her life, but the lives of countless others. Not just her world, but all worlds. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the sky above the integrated capital, as Lysandra governed with wisdom beyond her years, as species that had once existed in shadow, now walked freely in light, Isolde finally allowed herself to rest, to believe that the work was done, to trust that the future was in capable hands, to have faith that love in the end had proven stronger than fear. Faith isn't about certainty, she whispered to the darkness, to the light, to the infinite possibilities that stretched ahead. It's about taking the first step when you can't see the path, about choosing love over fear, about believing that the impossible is just waiting for someone brave enough to try him. And somewhere in the space between worlds, in the place where souls remembered what flesh forgot, Isolde heard her father's voice one last time. Well done, my daughter, well done.